Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a virtual tour of the exhibition, Any Distance Between Us, now on view at the RISD Museum. My name is Richard Bradley. I graduated in 1984 from the Light Metals Department and serve on the leadership team of the newly formed RISD Queer Alumni Affinity Group. RISD Queer Alumni strives to build an inclusive and connected community by highlighting queer artists and designers, their work, and their stories. Through our events and communications, we hope to increase dialogue and awareness for inclusion and social justice. So when the opportunity came to co-host this event with the RISD Museum and the curators of this exhibit, we were thrilled to be involved and invite our community in looking closely at and discussing works of contemporary art that address the themes of queer artists and artists of color. We're especially pleased that this presentation includes works by RISD alumni. We hope you enjoy the program, and I'm honored to pass you to our curators, Dominic Molon and Stephen Truax, who will introduce themselves. Thank you, Dominic and Stephen.
Hi, everybody.
Hello. Are we live?
I think we're live.
All right, fantastic.
It is my pleasure to introduce my co-curator, Dominic Molon, who is the curator of contemporary art at the Rhode Island School of Design Museum of Art. And it has been my honor over the last 3 years to work with Dominic to develop this very special exhibition and curatorial project called Any Distance Between Us.
And it's my pleasure to introduce Stephen Truax, who is an artist, writer, curator based in New York, also a RISD alum. Really have so much gratitude and respect for Stephen in producing this show for us during one of the most kind of ridiculous moments in human history, but making such a wonderfully beautiful and poetic show, and one that I think beyond its addressing notions of intimacy related to queer identity, to being an artist and a person of color, I think is something that we all can relate to in terms of the times that we've been living in, which have really been charged by notions of intimacy. I wanted to kind of start us off, Stephen. This is a very unusual way to walk through a show, but we're going to do it anyway, combining images of the exhibition, as you see here, with a RISD alum, Dina Lawson's photograph, as well as kind of close-up views to talk about specific works. But I wanted to kind of get us started by talking about kind of how things came about with the show. It's kind of two-pronged in a way. I think, on the one hand, Stephen and I got to know one another through the acquisition of the Jack Pearson work from the gallery where Stephen works, trying to read, a work that's in the show titled Cry. But while this was going on, Stephen was putting together an exhibition at the O.C. Milo Gallery titled Intimacy for summer 2018 that I did not see, but our previous director, John Smith, did see and became quite enamored of, and offered me the opportunity to invite Stephen to co-curate what would become the show. Stephen.
Exactly. And I think it's so telling and pertinent that we are doing our first museum walkthrough of this show on Zoom, a forum that has become so familiar to everybody in the last 2 years during the COVID-19 global pandemic. And this is more or less what Dominic and I did to work together to develop this exhibition. We were on Zoom a lot especially during, I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, Dominic, but it was a full 3-year period, but during the first few months of quarantine, we were especially active and engaged with one another, really through the darkest months of COVID. And obviously, by no means is this pandemic over, but I think it definitely casts a long shadow across this project. And it's so exciting to see these images of domestic intimacy coming out of that context. So I think that these images here, on the left, we have Kennedy Carter from the RISD Museum's collection, and Jess T. Dugan on the right from the RISD Museum's collection. And these are really images of lives lived at home together. And I think that these are both, in the context of this exhibition, important images to have on the museum's walls. They show what it's like living with somebody else over a long period of time, and to have that kind of family-like connection together.
Yeah, and Stephen, I think one of the things that I think is germane, since you've pointed out, to works from the collection flanking a work that we did borrow, and a work by an artist who was part of your intimacy show at Yossi Milo, Elliot Jerome Brown, is that this is always intended to be a show that drew on the RISD Museum's collection, that also included pointed and specific loans to the exhibition from outside of the museum's collection. Both of which you actually see two works here, one by Peter Hujar on the left, and Hugh Steers on the right. And so it was really intended to be this kind of sort of hybrid show that wasn't a purely loan show, but really shows a sort of dynamic relationship between the museum's collection and works on loan. Many works, some of which kind of come from a more historical perspective, as these two works here. Others, as Stephen, you often pointed out in your text, came directly from the artist's studio, possibly the paint still wet, really to kind of create this incredible dynamic between sort of institutional commitment, but also the flow of artistic life that's happening in the here and now.
Exactly. So the curatorial project at Yossi Milo in the summer of 2018 really emerged from this idea of seeing young queer identified artists making exciting new work that the New York art world had not yet previously seen, or had not seen in many, many years. And it became a fascination point for me to uncover the historical predecessors that led to this new kind of quote unquote queer figurative painting. I wrote about it extensively. I published articles about it, and I eventually did this curatorial project. And I was investigating artists like Kathy Bradford, Doron Langberg, Louis Fratino, and these people were involved in this previous exhibition, and I wanted to pair them with historical examples. And so RISD Museum really gave us, as you can see here, this opportunity to delve into their collection, which is extensive and very, very deeply invested in queer lives and queer artists. As you can see here, this is a beautiful example of a David Hockney drawing from 1967. And it's paired with a Louis Fratino, also part of the RISD Museum's collection. And I think these two artists, pairing them together, they're separated by almost 60 years. And the impetus is very closely aligned, very, very deeply related. And I think that Fratino would look to Hockney not only as an artistic inspiration, but as a personal inspiration. Right, Hockney sort of paved the way for Fratino to make this kind of work, which is super exciting to see them side by side, literally adjacent in the same room.
Yeah, and I want to kind of give here's a closer look of the Louis Fratino and another work from the collection, Doron Langberg, an artist that you just alluded to, Stephen. One of the things preceding the show that we were really doing at the museum and continue to do throughout the run of the show, or throughout the development of the show, was to acquire works by not only the artists that Stephen is talking about, but also artists that we felt really needed to be not only in the museum's collection but in the show. I think it's one thing to do an exhibition dedicated to this notion of queer aesthetics and how artists see themselves or represent themselves and their friends and their family as they want to be seen, but also making an institutional commitment to it, to dedicating the museum's collection not only in perpetuity, but also in situating it within an historical context. And I think that's one of the things that Stephen did really beautifully, and we received incredible assistance and support from other folks at the museum in terms of pointing us in directions of works that we might not have initially thought of, but were kind of brought to our attention and that we included in the exhibition.
And I really believe that this effort on the RISD Museum's part to acquire works, thinking about this show, but also in advance of this show, from these young artists is really radical. It's genuinely very, very exciting, because many other institutions do not have that same backbone commitment to queer artists. And RISD Museum putting its full weight behind this work and dedicating an entire show to this project is very, very exciting. I'm so grateful to have played a small role in it.
Stephen, I'm wondering if you could maybe, since we were on this slide, talk a little bit more about, kind of what makes this particular moment, really, since you've written about it, very thoughtfully and beautifully, just, kind of where are these artists, coming from in terms of Lou, in terms of Dora?
Louis Bertino is a young artist who lives and works in New York. He is in his late 20s. Doron Langberg is also a young artist who is 35 years old, was born in Israel and lives and works in New York. Both of these artists have had numerous solo exhibitions here in New York City and are represented by powerful galleries around the world. And we have seen an enormous amount of interest in these two young artists' work. And I think that we are seeing such a strong interest because they present a true view of their own lived experience of being young gay men. And as you can see, they fearlessly present images that are erotic, that are sentimental, they are sexually charged, and they are very obviously queer paintings. They are fearlessly queer paintings. And I think that many people have waited many years to see this kind of triumph of the queer experience and its public presentation. And I know that in certain politically liberal left-leaning circles, this does not seem to be as radical as it really is. Just this morning, I was talking to another curator about his difficulties in presenting similar works. And the backlash is strong. And I think that we need to really recognize that there are a lot of forces at work in our community of contemporary art, in museums and galleries, in enlightened places like the Northeast and Providence and in New York City, where this work is still not necessarily accepted wholesale. And so I think it's important for us to continue to advocate for these projects that so radically and honestly step out and present themselves as what they are, as these lived experiences by two young gay men.
I'm going to move on to, oops, I'm not going to move on just yet. Here we go. Salman Tour is an artist, I think, who kind of extends this tendency in painting that you're talking about in terms of a young queer artist, although he also brings a dimension into looking at this from the perspective as an artist of color as well, and wanting to make and represent people who look like him in these pictures, in these settings and scenarios. And, I think it is this, again, this demand, this taking the responsibility as an artist to represent, one's identity, one's people, as they wish for themselves to be seen, but also to show just the very subtle and everyday ways that they live. But one of the other things I think that's interesting in Salmon's case is this kind of evocation of traditional art history and sort of taking these traditional historical forms and folding in queer identities. I think one of the things that we also wanted to do with the show, we should probably talk about the title at some point, and the struggles to come up with one, was to, in addition to making a show that was really focusing on this moment of queer aesthetic in painting, in art, but also to bring others into the fold and into the picture, to look at not only intimate moments between individuals in terms of a romantic or erotics, but also in terms of family dynamics as well. And it's something I think that happens again with another RISD alum in the painting of Aaron Gilbert, who has repeatedly shown people of color in these really touching, wonderful, but often, sometimes rather fraught situations in moments of intimacy. This is a piece called Greyhound Lines that shows possibly a granddaughter and a grandmother, possibly a daughter and mother, possibly an aunt and a niece, making a transcontinental trip via Greyhound. So really situating a particular class, particular kind of event, particular moment, but filled with these incredibly beautiful, touching, the way that the woman's braid circles the doll's hair. So just to, I think, kind of show that this moment of this sort of addressing the notion of intimacy is something that's not only, I think, informing queer aesthetics, but also artists of various identities, stripes, etc.
Yeah, I wanted to just briefly address Aaron Gilbert as well. Aaron and I were at RISD in the painting department together. He was a couple of years ahead of me, and I remember very vividly as a sophomore first-year painter going upstairs and seeing Aaron's work and being totally blown away by it. And it's just so thrilling to have that connection from over 15 years ago be reinstated here, and to see the museum acquire this work for its permanent collection. And I think the phrase that Dominic and I kept coming to as we were developing this program is, why not include an artist like Aaron Gilbert? And the issue here is not that we want to identify Aaron's work as queer. It's instead we want to expand the project so that it's not only about queer identity. So we didn't want to ghettoize this effort. Instead, we wanted to expand this notion of intimacy and family intimacy to many different projects, and trace the kind of language or effort that these artists use through time together. And so I think Aaron Gilbert's painting fits perfectly here into this exhibition.
And we, it was interesting because Stephen had already taken maybe the most obvious title for his show in 2018 to talk about notions of intimacy. And so I think we scoured our own iTunes, watched, many kind of movies, or thought of other sort of ways that we could kind of phrase something that would help to kind of encapsulate the show. And somehow we came on this kind of phrase, any distance between us, as something where we began to notice, and I think it's really quite maybe interestingly shown in the Catherine Opie photograph where you have this couple embracing. There were a number of images of couples very much kind of seen together, but also the notion of distance, the notion of proximity, the way that intimacy presumes a certain kind of closeness, perhaps between, subject and the between the observer and the subject of a work of art, but also that intimacy doesn't necessarily need to be something that has a physical proximity, that it's a more emotional, that it has a different kind of valence to it. And so, we thought of this kind of phrase. I think Stephen, kind of came up with the phrase, and I found it really interesting. It felt like a sort of fragment that you'd find in like a love letter or something. Like any distance between us is too painful to think of, or something that had a really kind of poetically incomplete, but also helped to summarize, I think, one of the key things that kind of transcended all of the works in the show. I'm presenting two more works from the collection here by El Perez and Catherine Opie to demonstrate that it's not just about painting, that it's a tendency of thinking about queer intimacy as something that obviously extends into other mediums. I think I put these two together because Catherine Opie's domestic series was one that I became aware of in the 90s, and was something I thought was really interesting in terms of developing her exploration of queer identity in a very different way than the work that she had initially become known for, by situating being more documentary than sort of formal presentation, and also kind of situating folks in their own homes rather than, I guess, sort of sphere blank background, as a way to, I think, really kind of reach into and create this wonderful portrait of queer intimacy through lesbian couples from across the country. Stephen, maybe if you would want to talk about the El Perez, since El was they're an artist who was part of your intimacy show.
Yeah, I love these two photographs together, and if I could have gotten a Kathy Opie for the Yossi Mila show, I definitely would have. But I love these two photographs together, both acquired with this presentation and for the RISD Museum's permanent collection, because it shows how there is a relationship between these two figures in the Opie from 1998, right? It's any distance between them, I suppose, because they're in a relationship and very obviously connected in domestic space, versus the Perez, which seems to indicate a relationship between the subject, who is Aurora Mattia, another artist included in the exhibition, and the photographer, Elle. And so I think that this notion of distance between us, the artist and their subject, and here Opie, where it's representing a relationship, is two important perspectives that we wanted to include in this presentation. It's not merely about showing domestic intimacy between two other people, but also experiencing it. When you're standing in front of Elle's photograph, it's as though the subject is looking back at you, like you're having some kind of interaction. And it's very intimate, as you can see, like, Aurora is is dressed in a negligee. It's very, very, very sexy. And I think that that's an important thing happening, right? That we're sort of interacting with that subject.
I think it happens elsewhere. I'm not sure if we'll be showing other images in the show, but I think Elle's photograph, kind of engages this notion that I found very interesting in thinking about in terms of intimacy occurring not only in a domestic space, which is where we tend to, our mind kind of automatically goes there, but the way that intimacy plays out in public settings as well. And something that I think is increasingly important in terms of moving more towards a society where queer couples feel the agency, the wherewithal to be intimate in a public setting. And so, it was interesting in terms of thinking through, what images of Elle's. This is one that Stephen brought to our attention. We would consider not only for the show but for the collection. This is one that certainly recommended itself and became an interesting complement to a number of other works that kind of play out this notion of intimacy in the public.
It's such a great photograph. These are such great examples from these two artists' work. I mean, really, and they're and spreading them apart by over 20 years is so exciting. The length of production. Obviously, Perez grew up looking at Opie photographs. It's a brilliant juxtaposition. It's really, really great.
It's something I think we wanted to do, Stephen, in thinking about, really artists who, were clearly looking at others' work to not only present artists of the here and now, but and artists who are still working, obviously, like Kathy, but who have already had an enormous influence on subsequent generations, and in many ways paved the way to kind of made these first forays into making this kind of imagery possible and putting it out there for subsequent generations to sort of build on and create expressions of their own moment as well. So since this is kind of a walkthrough of the show, we'll kind of take a little bit through the show. I don't know if you want to talk about anything in terms of how sort of the show kind of came together, was laid out.
Absolutely, sure. So as everybody can see here, there was a real strong effort paid to bringing in artworks that cross a lot of different material boundaries. We did not want this to be just a painting show or just a photography show, though painting and photography feature heavily in it. We also made a lot of effort to include sculpture and what I would call a kind of conceptual art project. So the work of Patrick Carroll, who created these beautiful garments that you can see here in the center. They are hand knit on a knitting machine, but the artist is actually trained as a poet. He's going to UC Irvine to get his MFA in poetry. And so they're embroidered with phrases or words that are very evocative and powerful as well. And so working with the lead technician at the RISD Museum, Stephen Wing, we developed this extraordinary solution to displaying these three artworks by Patrick Carroll. The artist had not previously shown them this way, but we suspended them on a steel rod from the ceiling over this beautiful platform. So I think everybody was really, including the artist, was absolutely thrilled with how this came together. And of course, to be juxtaposed with the Felix Gonzalez Torres light string installation called Couple, Untitled Couple, 1991, which is a very important work and example of Felix Gonzalez Torres's oeuvre, and we're so honored and proud to have it here in the exhibition. It was a huge, huge win for us to have secured this. And finally, the work of Tom Burr, which are these two leather-topped stools, one on top of a mirror-clad platform, which is another very special work that the museum has acquired for its permanent collection. Burr has done a number of different evocative installations of quote unquote everyday objects and positioning them in suggestive arrangements. And this one in particular seems to suggest the leather of a gay bar and the mirror-clad surface of a gay bar. In fact, the first gay bar I ever went to was in Providence, Rhode Island. It's still open to this day. It's called Mirror Bar, and it is, as you guessed, covered in the mirror-clad plating along the walls. And so you're sort of having this experience where you're actually 17, listening to the ABBA song about dancing at 17. And anyway, for me, like everything is sort of wrapped up in this very, very simple and economic display of material and objects in this Tom Burr sculpture. So it's having these three in. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think, in addition to, kind of expanding the material, presence, I think we felt, I wanted to kind of focus on the Patrick Carroll because we have Felix kind of coming up a little as a slide in a little bit, but I think he brought a bit of a RISD kind of ethos to the show in terms of expanding it into, there's such a strong kind of interdisciplinarity to not only the museum, but RISD in general. So I think like bringing in, kind of costume and wearable clothing, I think was really interesting. But I just wanted to focus on Patrick because, it was one of the instances of like a sort of maybe slight generational divide or maybe personality divide between me and Stephen, because you are far more active on Instagram and social media than I am, who's almost gotten completely off of it. But I found it really wonderful that we became familiar with Patrick's work through Instagram. And I think you also saw another iteration of Elle's photograph through that as well. So, I think it's been kind of interesting in terms of doing an exhibition in 2021 and how, different technologies, I think I was, kind of plowing through the storage racks here in real space, but the way that you were able to sort of tap into a very different kind of resource and exposure to work out there in the world was kind of an interesting way that the show came together.
Yes, I have a personal relationship with a number of the artists in the show, and I'm friends and acquaintances of many of them. And I just wanted to point out that a lot of them are also connected and are friends. And it's been really wonderful to be a part of this community of artists that are actively working here in New York City and spending summers or part of summer out on Fire Island. And it was really that friendship and that camaraderie and kinship, spending time out there with Elle, with Doron Langberg, with TM Davy, and seeing how they transformed the beach into a really creative space where being out on Fire Island is not just merely about being on vacation, but also it's a productive space to live and make work. So that has been really a wonderful an important underbelly of this exhibition is really kind of delving into this artist community and getting to understand them in greater depth.
I'm gonna maybe move a couple of slides forward just to kind of give folks,
just so everybody knows, this is a TM Davy here on the right.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And he is paired with Patrick Angus on the left, and
previously we had Christopher Caho, who teaches at RISD.
Spent 10 years teaching at RISD. He taught art history, and then he was a lecturer in the painting department.
Yeah, and there you see that kind of synthesis or exposition of historical moments from Patrick Angus of the 80s to Paul Cadmus in the 50s to TM Davy in the very much here and now. Kind of moving left to right, Jack Pearson, Angela Dufresne, teaching at RISD now, Sholem Kristalka, Nan Golden, and this incredible Robert Mapplethorpe. And a number of those works on that wall, but also here, I think I wanted Stephen to pivot to talking about the loans that we brought into the museum. Obviously, the RISD Museum's collection was key in providing a certain foundation from which to work, but there were works that are not part of the collection, maybe not yet part of the collection, that were really key and were an important link between, again, your intimacy show and this one. And I'm wondering, Stephen, if you could maybe speak to Hugh and Patrick's work as transition from that show to this one.
Absolutely. So Patrick Angus and Hugh Steers are two very important artists that came up for me in my research when I was developing this text about where did queer figurative painting come from, and then eventually the intimacy show in 2018. And Steers died in 1995 of HIV-related complications, and Angus died in 1992 of AIDS-related complications, and it would be impossible to discuss an intergenerational exhibition of queer artwork without addressing the AIDS epidemic. And naturally, HIV continues to be an extremely problematic and challenging health crisis around the world, particularly in the US, American South. It continues to spread due to a lack of resources and a lack of education and a lack of government funding, very much the same way that we saw it spreading in the 1980s and early 1990s in New York City and around the world. But Steers and Angus were both living and working in New York in the 1980s and 1990s. Steers dedicated much of his practice to the idea of what it is like to care for a lover who is dying of AIDS. And so here we see a very tender moment between two men in their domestic apartment, likely in New York City. Steers actually went to Yale with a couple of my professors who also went to Yale. And so I felt a very strong affinity with his work because of its very kind of Angels in America style honesty about the difficulty of living with someone who is dying of AIDS. And he made very frank depictions of what it's like, of the sort of procedural problems that one would face. And in addition to that, how you can sort of reclaim agency within that. And so, and a lot of times you'll see Steers, a man in a hospital gown putting on high-heeled shoes, for example. Angus, on the other hand, is very famous for his very frank depictions of gay porn theaters in Times Square, which were hotbeds of gay anonymous cruising for sex. And here we selected this much more tender colored pencil work because we felt that number one, it was in a domestic interior, but number two, we wanted to illuminate this other aspect of the artist's work. He's so famous for the New York, the Times Square, New York City images. And I think that showing this more tender side is really wonderful too. And as you can see, Angus was a huge fan of David Hockney and really looked up to him as a hero. And Hockney eventually met Angus during his lifetime and even bought work to help support the young artist. And so there's, as you can see, there's a strong relationship between their two works here in this exhibition and also elsewhere throughout their oeuvre.
And, I think it's really lovely the way that, T.M. Davy, an artist working, very much in the moment, is presented, as you might have seen in one of the previous install shots, kind of in relationship to Angus to kind of carry on that narrative or that arc from Hockney to Angus to TM. I'm kind of putting it here with Wolfgang Tilmons because I think one of the things that Stephen and I felt, and I think it came across, Stephen, when you were talking about the sculptural work as well, was there's a lot of very pictorial presentations of figurative intimacy and relationships, but wanting to explore notions of intimacy that were maybe more about objects, more about these kind of experiences that happen sort of in the flow of life. Whether it's like a T-shirt that has certain kinds of stains on it, even though we're just a T-shirt that was kind of cast aside after sexual activity or not. But these things that evoke a sense of intimacy, a sense of closeness that don't necessarily have a figure involved, but still get you to that place, and that notion of representing this thematic, I think was really key in how we built the show.
And just as a side note, I'd like to point out that Tilmons spends a lot of time on Fire Island as well, and is personally friends with T.M. Davy and has photographed him. And Davy, in turn, has made drawings of Tilmons taking photographs on the beach. And so I think that this slide is, again, a very special way to sort of like celebrate that artistic collaboration. And I think we need to turn it over to Q&A. Did we miss any important? Should we do?
Just speaking maybe
We should
quickly. Yeah, I mean, no, I think, Felix, again, in that sort of spirit of, more object, less people, but obviously these are objects that sort of note and represent in a very abstract way two figures, two lovers, was important. And Felix is certainly someone who is like one of the most influential artists of the 20th, 21st century, as a figure who the show couldn't kind of happen without. And, if you could speak to Kathy just kind of quickly.
Absolutely. When I was developing, I've worked with Kathy in a number of different curatorial projects throughout the last five years or so. And for this one, I wrote to Kathy, I sent her a text and I was like, I want you to send me your sexiest painting of two lesbians. And this is what she came back with. And it's called Lifelong Lovers, which is just so tender and powerful to see these two women embracing one another at the seaside, which is a regular motif in Kathy's work. And it's been wonderful to see these figures develop through her project and her last few solo shows. And I'm so honored and happy to have this beautiful painting here in the show. And I don't think that you'd ever find a Kathy and a Felix next to one another, juxtaposed in an exhibition. And I just love that this premise opens that possibility up, because I think that the impetus there is the same for Felix and for Kathy, to show this kind of permanent connection between two individuals.
Kathy has a show up at the Carpenter Center, not too far from here, up there in Boston, Cambridge. So see it. But we're now ready for Q&A as we move to this more general image of the show.
Great. Dominic, if you want to stop sharing your screen, we can transition to having you answer questions.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Claire Robinson. I'm just going to be reading out the questions for Dominic and Stephen. Thank you again so much for doing this. This has been really wonderful and fascinating. So the first question is, in your research for this exhibit, what are some of the biggest changes you see in how queer studies and queer art histories are understood?
That is a big question. I think that to just kind of as quickly as possible address that very, very huge question, I'd love to just point out that what I see now is this kind of extraordinary public awareness, if not acceptance or celebration, then at least awareness of queer lifestyles and queer togetherness. And so in television shows like Glee or Big Little Lies or major blockbuster movies, queerness has been sort of destigmatized in a certain way in at least American pop culture. And so I think that we also see that emerging in contemporary art. Artists like Fratino, Langberg, Davy, Tour are less afraid to present a more frank view of their erotic and romantic experiences in their lived everyday lives. And I think that the public's acceptance and gallery and major commercial galleries' acceptance and promotion of those presentations is important. And that is what prompted me to start this investigation into what was it like before, what was it like in the 1990s, what was it like in the 1980s. And the earliest work we have in the show is by Vaughan, a British artist who made his work in 1957. And Vaughan and Dominic, please speak to this if you can help me, but was not publicly out as a homosexual artist. But you can see in the painting that he made, there is a strong affinity and eroticism in that figurative painting, and that is why we decided to include that work. And I just don't see the same kind of stigma in the artists that are of my generation and even younger that are included in this show.
Yeah, it's being old enough to have gone to grad school during I think one kind of part of kind of queer theory becoming a very much part of my academic experience being in grad school in like the early 90s. Particularly since I did my master's thesis on Bob Gober, it was very much something I had immersed myself in. It's really interesting in terms of following some of the reading through into the present day, the way that it has opened up in terms of I think one of the things, and certainly the presence of Elle and Aurora's work underscores this, is the expansion of the conversation to include trans individuals, to include considerations of gender and sexuality that really start to expand in a much broader spectrum than it certainly was when I was coming of age as an arts history student, as a kind of curatorial hopeful in the 80s and 90s.
Great, thank you. I think you may have touched on this slightly, but when visiting the exhibition in person, I was struck by and really loved the content warning sign that read, "This exhibition contains intimate imagery." Could you talk about your experiences in curating shows with queer, explicit, intimate imagery? Did you experience any pushback or challenges, and how do you deal with these challenges to realize and advocate for these works to be included?
Well, I think that, one of the artists featured in the show, Wolfgang Tilmons, is an artist that I'd worked with previously at the MCA Chicago. And while we didn't experience any, kind of issues with the work in that presentation, when the show traveled to the Hirshhorn Museum in DC, someone defaced, actually ripped an image of a close-up of two men kissing that was in the exhibition. And Wolfgang dealt with the work very poetically in instructing us not to take the work down and take it off view, but instead to take the work back up and show it in its kind of torn apart state as a gesture of defiance, as a way to kind of address that. And so I think it's as Stephen was, I think, saying, it's something that creating an exhibition like this in a public sphere that's not a commercial gallery, that's a place that is very much open to the public, in the public trust, and knowing that there's going to be a broad range of folks who come through, some of whom may not be where we would hope people would be with the kind of work that and subject matter that we're presenting. So
I think that RISD Museum did a great job of including challenging works, and also giving Dominic and I the space to contextualize those works in a larger dialogue and in an art historical context that would make sense, that would underscore why these are important artworks. And I'm very, very grateful for the museum, which does, as Dominic said, have a wide range of constituents, some of whom are very young children, some of whom are very, very, generationally, there's a huge generation span for the museum. And it's been exciting to develop wall labels and essays and texts and press releases that give voice and agency to these works that are in certain contexts considered to be inappropriate. And once you give that context, I think that it becomes very clear, and it becomes very obvious why these artists decided to present nude figures, or present erotically charged situations, or present queer coupling, right? Queer togetherness, as Dominic pointed out with the Tilmons at NCA Chicago. So I think that this is a very, very long and historically important discussion, and I think that the RISD Museum is right at the forefront of presenting radical material in a very exciting and educational context. You know, right? It gives you the reason why.
Great, thank you. Part of the magic of the show is its intimate, small scale. Could you imagine taking over a bigger space with things that got left on the cutting room floor? If so, who or what would you include?
Oh my gosh. Well, just while you were talking, Dominic, I was like, why don't we have a Bob Gober in the show again?
Oh, yeah.
I would have loved to have a Bob Gober in
Yeah.
the show. And I mean, the editing that had to go into this show was very, very stringent. And we really worked hard at cutting, you know, it was not about getting more material, it was about cutting down, getting less material. And we really wanted these works we wanted to have a generous presentation with a lot of material, but we also wanted to give those works room enough to breathe and to have their own space to sing. And there was a lot left by the wayside, and this is by no means an exhaustive presentation of queer art from 1957 to present. You know, I would love the opportunity to do something more inclusive and bigger and better. And I mean, frankly, I would just love more space, but you know, we're working within a number of different confines, and I think that this is a really extraordinary solution to that problem. It's a generous show. It's one that spans a lot of material, a lot of time, and a lot of different artists, a lot of different backgrounds, and it's great to see it all come together so seamlessly in this very chapel-like beautiful space.
Yeah, it's funny. I think, like, I don't know, maybe I've psychologically just kind of blocked out like all the things that we had to cut because it was so painful to do so. Yeah, I don't know. It's and I'm just like, you always draw a blank. You know, it's funny because I think, like, you know, we had to cut out things from this presentation. You know, David Warnerovitz is an artist who casts a huge shadow over so much of the work, and his work, thankfully, is in the show. You know, one of the things I want to sort of tip my hat not only to Stephen, who literally drove some of the works up from New York to help us, and I've kind of save a few bucks here and there in a time when you know, pulling back budget-wise and economically was thrust upon us by the pandemic, but also galleries that really stepped up to and really believed in the show and what Stephen and I were trying to do with the show in making work available and sending it, helping us get it here to Providence. But yeah, so I think I'd rather maybe dwell on what's in it rather than what we didn't get to put in it. But we, you know, I think we probably could have curated a museum's worth of work through this show, and it's perhaps a show that really needs to be done. One of the shows that I was very aware of coming up as a professional in my early days was Larry Rinder's In a Different Light at the Berkeley Museum, which was dedicated in the early 90s to the subject of queer art. And I think it's a show that desperately needs to be updated. A museum of a certain scale, I think, really needs to step up and do the 2020s iteration of that show. To I think kind of speak to the point that someone brought up earlier in terms of what's changed, and to demonstrate the much larger conversation that's happening within LGBTQIA2S plus, and represent that institutionally.
I totally agree with everything that Dominic just said. And I just wanted to also say that each one of these artists that we're including is incredible. I mean, each one of these artists could be the subject of their own show and have been often and could be again. I would love to include more examples of their work. Like, for example, Duran, like just Alvin Baltrop, for example, right? He was a wonderful photographer who was active, like Wojnarowicz, in New York City, going regularly to anonymous gay cruising sites on the West Side Highway called the Piers, which were abandoned structures frequented by gay men. And he would take extraordinarily beautiful photographs documenting these interactions that he was having or observing from a distance. And we have a photograph that's about this big, and we're so grateful for Buchholz's help in securing that material for this show. But he could have a whole wall. I mean, his work is incredible, and I would love the opportunity to go into further depth with each of one of these artists.
I have a couple more questions and then we'll wrap it up. I know we're coming up on top of the hour here. Was there a focus or an effort in thinking specifically about queer artists of color and queer artists of color art history or expression for this exhibit?
I think there was, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Dominic.
Yeah, no, I think, as we said, you just alluded to one of those artists, Alvin Baltrop, I think, like looking at, generationally, a sort of arc from, Alvin to Elliot Jerome Brown, but also looking not just, again, at queer artists of color, but artists of color generally, given the strengths of work that's in the collection by Dina Lawson, by Aaron Gilbert, which came in. It was, something in terms of, I think that we were trying to, kind of create an exhibition that really focused on, at one and the same time, queer aesthetics, but also the subject of intimacy and how best to do that with the resources available to us from the museum, but also in a way that, kind of expanded the conversation into sort of family relationships. Kennedy Carter's self-portrait with her father kind of off camera, shaving her head. And so, it was, that was, I think, a challenge in terms of how to, create a cohesive show and be able to think through a number of different, aesthetics, representations all at once.
I totally agree. We definitely made inclusion of artists of color and queer artists of color a huge priority for this show. And I wanted to just quickly address the work of Christopher Caho in this context. Christopher was born in Hong Kong, raised in Los Angeles, and travels back and forth between Hong Kong and New York now pretty regularly. And his work is totally unexpected for this exhibition. It's a conceptual artwork that consists of a music stand with 2 letterpress printed music sheets, and on one of those music sheets, he has letterpress printed a beautiful poem. It's a sort of list poem describing the different activities one might do in a relationship in order to keep that relationship going. So one item is put the duvet cover with buttons on my side. Like these small, subtle things that we do in relationship. And I think that Ho really is an artist of color, right? He is Asian and he is ethnically Chinese, and his work reflects that. And so often Ho has not been seen in that context as an artist of color, or certainly not a queer artist of color. But I think once we put him in that context, his work sort of opens up in a different way, in a new way. And this exhibition was an opportunity to do that. So I'm really grateful to have his work in it.
I want to add one more thing in terms of procedurals. One of the things that, Stephen definitely kind of experienced, I maybe experienced it a little bit more, but, the RISD, various members of the RISD Museum staff, were involved in, really talking through, issues of representation, the content of the show. It's very much a sort of team process and effort here. I mean, you see two guys, kind of sitting before you as curators of the show, but the show is very much developed with the very active participation of various individuals at the RISD Museum. And I think it's one of the things that I think is really special about the museum is there's such an incredible kind of agency that's given to the staff in terms of allowing their voice to be heard, allowing it to play a real generative and active role in the development of programming, development of a checklist even, of an exhibition. And so bringing into consideration not only issues of race, gender, sexuality, but also class as well. So, you see a show, but it's very much not just, kind of the thoughts of Stephen and I, but very actively and heavily informed.
Thank you. So final question. Given the speaker's initial comments about the mixed response queer artist experience in the United States, what advice would you give to RISD students that want to explore queer themes in their professional work and practice? And how should students connect into a queer supporting, I think, network of gallerists and fellow artists?
I genuinely would love for students at RISD to see this exhibition as an invitation to directly and fearlessly address their lived experience in their work. And if that is a queer experience, then that should be in your work. When I was at RISD, I did not have a seamless experience. I did not have an easy time at the Rhode Island School of Design. And in certain circumstances, I was discouraged from doing explicitly queer work or themed queer work. And I would encourage you to look at the show and to see really the celebration of a triumph of queer work, of queer artists, and through your development of relationships in the professional world, you will find who your allies are. You will find who is going to support you in your work, and who is going to not, or try to modify or change it, or ask you to not do it, or ask you to not show it, or there's always going to be pushback. But I think that once you find a supportive network of artists and professionals that you can work with, you will find the support that you need, like as I did with this exhibition. I found a really wonderful, supportive group of people here at RISD Museum, from the former director, John Smith, to my co-curator, Dominic Molon, all the way, to, Stephen Wing, who I only met at the last, installation day when we were installing the show in July, and they all made this happen. And everybody worked together to make this happen. And I think that investment and that kind of group, coming together to make this all work for these queer artists and artists of color is an amazing, it's a win. It's a huge win. And so you should look at that as a win.
And I want to thank you, Stephen, for allowing me to be a supportive ally in that capacity, and also urge folks to be allies, to be to step up and promote this work and do this work, regardless of to champion it. And thank you.
Thank you, Dominic. This has been such a pleasure, and I can't wait to do it with you in person in October.
Indeed. Well, it is October next week.
Oh my gosh.
You're still on Basel time.
I guess. So
I guess we're getting over to Richard too.
that's right. Richard, thank you so much for having both of us. We are
Yes,
so
thank
grateful
you.
for the
Thank you for hosting.
Well, we were glad to have you. Thank you so much, Dominic and Stephen, for sharing the presentation with our community and shining light on these artists and their work. I encourage everyone to see this exhibit in person if you can. It's on view until March 13th, 2022. And for anyone who is interested in learning more about the RISD Queer Alumni group, you can find information about us on the alumni website and the RISD network. And we hope you can join us on October 9th during the RISD weekend for our first in-person gathering on campus. Thank you so much for everybody who came, and take care.